Did you know that beer was probably created by accident? It's true. Centuries ago, one of our ancestors left their store of grain in a wet place, microscopic yeast started the fermentation process, and voila.
But it actually goes deeper. Families would pass down stirring sticks that were used in making beer because they thought they were magic. Turns out, people just didn't know how yeast worked yet.
Hello, I'm Dan Schultz. I'm responsible for making sure everything on the Grommet website is exactly where it should be. Is where that goes, that's where that goes, that is not where that goes.
I'm Alessandra Hankinson, and I find products for the Grommet. From touchless vacuums to granola bar makers, I'm on the hunt for anything innovative. I moved in with a guy who loves brewing beer.
My friends got me into brewing beer.
So I've always loved craft beer, but I really got into it with the idea of recreating my favorite beers that I didn't have access to. My favorite beer is from a brewery in Vermont called Fiddlehead, and they actually make this little beer called Hodad. It's a chocolate, vanilla, toasted coconut porter, and it's so good.
I'm kind of an enthusiastic dabbler. When I got out of college, I thought I'm a real adult now, and I started cooking for myself more and became a bit of a foodie, as most people do at that age, and started drinking beer that wasn't light lager out of a 30 rack. And around this time, some of my friends were getting pretty sophisticated with their own homebrew setup. So I went along, watched them a few times, and eventually I got my own homebrew kit.
So a homebrewing kit is a really good place to start, and it's typically called extract brewing.
Malt extract is the sugars that have been separated from the grains, and it's sort of like a thick syrup.
So usually it includes pure extract of the beer, and it takes care of some of those initial messy first steps.
Eventually, most brewers will graduate to an all-grain setup, and that's where you get your own toasted barley, grind it, and start making your own mash, which is essentially like a grain tea. The equipment at this stage can be pretty expensive, but many people choose to go DIY and make their own.
So our setup is intense. We have a 5-gallon all-grain setup, which means that we actually make our own mash, which is the process of extracting the sugars from the grain. So we have these giant 8-gallon kettles with built-in thermometers, and we also have these big Gatorade coolers for making the mash. We have a ton of bottles, like feet and feet of hose, more hose than I ever thought I would own in my life. And we bring it all out into the kitchen when we're brewing, and then when we're not, it takes up an entire closet.
I started with an extract kit, so this came with a big 5-gallon pot and a big spoon and a couple of buckets for fermenting and bottling the beer. But I've recently upgraded to an all-grain setup. So I buy grains in bulk, and I have a pasta roller that I've converted into a grain mill, and everything ends up in a 1-gallon Gatorade cooler that I've converted into a mash tun by adding a spigot and a radiator hose at the bottom. So I've got a lot more control now, and I'm brewing more smaller batches and just making generally better beer. The first thing to keep in mind is sanitation.
Sanitation.
Sanitizing is really important.
Sanitation.
Like hazmat levels of sanitation.
Sorry, but yes, sanitation is extremely important. You should sanitize to the point of insanity. If you put your spoon down on the counter for even a second, do not even think about putting that anywhere near the beer.
If things aren't sanitized perfectly, at best you'll end up with beer that's a little bit tart, but at worst you could have completely ruined beer and have put in months of effort with nothing to show for it.
I wish I knew how annoying bottling was. It's a pain, it's messy, you have to clean all the bottles individually and fill each one, so I really only keg from now on. I also wish I knew how much you needed to sanitize everything. Have I mentioned that enough?
Even today, I wish I knew a little bit more about carbonation. When you bottle your beer, you introduce a little bit more sugar to get the yeast reactivated and to get them starting producing carbon dioxide again. But if you add too little, you can open your beer in a few weeks and discover that it's flat. But if you add too much, so much CO2 builds up in the bottle that you can actually turn them into tiny bombs.
So there's also bottle conditioning, which is a little bit more manual, and this is when you mix the sugar in at the end of the process to reactivate the yeast, and it carbonates directly in the bottle, but this can take weeks, and you have to be careful because if you put too much sugar in the bottle, it'll actually explode.
It can be a fine line between brewing beer and making an explosive sometimes.
When we created our own replica of my favorite beer, so we actually ended up creating our own coconut extract. So we took about 5 pounds of coconut and had to boil it down until we created our own extract. And we brought the beer to a homebrew showcase, and we had about 200 people try the beer, and we had really great feedback. And so that was awesome. That was a great feeling.
The first time I made beer with my all grain setup and it came out well was very satisfying, making that jump from extract to all grain. I also brewed an apricot beer that came out pretty well, and I made it from real apricots, not a flavor extract, so I had to peel and sanitize and pasteurize them, but it worked and the beer came out great. My parents were visiting and they were interested in brewing, so I made an extract batch with them. We went to our local homebrew shop and asked for kind of an up-the-middle IPA recipe. And I'm not sure if it was the recipe or something we did, but it did not come out good. It was too dark and too bitter, and while it was technically drinkable, we had 5 gallons of pretty mediocre beer, most of which is still up in my attic.
So this is kind of brewing related. I brewed this really great hibiscus kombucha from a SCOBY that I was given, and it was so good. And my friends loved it. They said it was the best they ever had. And then I tried to brew a second batch, and it actually got infected, probably from a sanitation error. And it was really, really gross and really weird. And I never want to brew kombucha again because it really freaked me out.
This all must sound super intimidating.
So I know we're making this sound terrible, but I promise it's a lot of fun.
There's a lot of waiting.
At least 6 weeks.
Start with an extract kit to give yourself some wiggle room and go from there.
And start small and try to tinker or take a little bit more of control of the process as you learn. You don't need to produce a perfect keg or even gallon of beer on your first go.
When I got my first brewing kit, it came with a little instructional DVD, and at the end, the message they gave was that if you can make macaroni and cheese, you can brew beer. So anyone can make beer.
Good luck and sanitize everything.